Hello, Goodman Games fans. Welcome to another episode of the Scrivenery, where we are here to talk about all subjects of third-party publishing. I am your host, Ed Stanek, and with me tonight is the Goodman Games stalwart, Michael Curtis. Say hello to the folks, Michael.
Hey everybody, welcome. I'm so used to hosting these things, so I will try not to commandeer the show as we go on. So thank you very much for having me on, Ed, and hello everybody out there.
Unfortunately, Trevor isn't feeling well, so he won't be joining us tonight. So we'll all have some well wishes for him. And I was gonna put together a list of topics for tonight, but I just sat there staring at my computer screen and just nothing was coming to me for hours. No, really. But tonight's topic is very much that sort of thing. We're going to talk about writer's block, something that I think anyone who's engaged in creative endeavors occasionally runs into, and I guess more generically, not necessarily just writer's block, but creative block. And we're going to talk about some thoughts and strategies we have for getting beyond that. But before we dive in, um, I'm kind of curious to slightly abuse my position here, to ask Michael, how'd you get started with Goodman Games?
Okay, well that is a story. As Harley Stroh once explained to me, he said everybody in this business has a gateway in that is perfectly shaped like them. And once you get squeezed through that ebony, they shut the gate behind you, and then nobody else can get in that way. So, the way that I kind of got in over the transom was back in 2008 when when the OSR was had blown up at that point, not blown up in the good way, that blown up in the bad way. That came later, blown up in the really good way, where it was just everybody had a blog, and there's the whole, the OSR blogosphere was very, 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 pertinent, and everybody was exchanging ideas. I had been kind of on a hiatus from the hobby for a number of years. After college, I had fallen into that, like not enough time to game, but like I was still buying like role playing game products to read and everything, but I hadn't really played anything. And but then like I went through some major life changes in about 2008, and I was like, what did I used to do for fun? And then I realized I used to do role playing games. So I got 3.0, which was like, the flavor at that time, and I started looking, and it's like, maybe I'll find some people who do role playing. And I read through the third edition. I was like, this is far more complex than I remember.
Yeah.
So I said, let me find a way. Let me see if there's anybody who's like, backward, back reverse engineering this into the games that I used to remember.
Hmm.
And that's when I discovered people were still playing second edition. They were still playing, first edition. They were still playing like, original, Little Brown Book OD&D. And
Hmm.
my way in was Molde Cook, the BX, the BX. So through that I discovered the OSR, and like everybody, I started my own blog. And my blog was, it wasn't one of the big ones, but it was relatively popular. And I wanted to take a break for about 2 weeks, so I didn't want to post anything. So I wrote a series which I called the Dungeon Alphabet, which was basically the summing up of the classic tropes of dungeon design. And I figured I'd put those online, and I'd take 2 weeks off and not having to blog. And after the first week, I got an email from Joe Goodman saying, I've been looking at the blog, and I really like this Dungeon Alphabet thing. Would you ever consider developing it for a commercial RPG release? And I did a little looking online, and he looked legit. So I said, all right, yeah, sure, why not? So he commissioned me to write the Dungeon Alphabet,
Nice.
and that's what I did. And it was very well received. So there was a time when it was the best-selling Goodman Games product.
Huh.
And that was my first hit right out of the gate. And the Dungeon Alphabet was kind of, I found out later, it was the testing ground for DCC in the sense of layout and art. Because like prior to the Dungeon Alphabet, everything was in that very much that classic two column, like, half page art, quarter page art,
Hmm.
or something like that. But Joe wanted to play around with ideas for layout and see if you could kind of incorporate art and text together.
Hmm.
And so we did it for the Dungeon Alphabet, and it worked. So Joe said, "Let me lay out an entire rule book using this style," and that's where we got the DCC rule book we know and love. That layout of it. So that was me in through the door, and Joe discovered that not only could I write okay, but more importantly, I hit deadlines. So that became a relationship that has now culminated in me being director of product development for Dungeon Crawl Classic. So as I say, it was a series of poor life choices that led me to where I am.
All right. You mentioned about hitting deadlines. I think it's greatly underappreciated how significant that is. It's one thing to be able to do some good work, but to be reliable, that's a treasure right there.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, there are a ton of people out there, and you out there in TV land, maybe one of those people who are like, oh, I'm amazingly creative. I write the best stuff and everything, and that's fine if if you're writing for yourself or everything. But if you're writing for somebody else, there are a whole bunch of other people who are, their ability to do their job is tied in with your ability to deliver stuff on time.
Hmm.
And speaking from like a developing point of view, I would most likely I would go for somebody who has less talent but is dependable over somebody who is like really creative but a diva. I mean, that's just simply I mean, when the bottom line comes, you can do this for fun as a hobby, but once you start doing this professionally, I mean, there's artists who have to know what they're supposed to be illustrating. There's editors that need to get stuff done. There's layout. There's a whole back end that I wasn't really aware of until I had been doing this for a while. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that dovetails well actually with what we're going to dive into because sometimes when you're dealing with a creative project, you hit that point where it's hard to get across the finish line. And so we're going to give some thoughts about how you can help make that happen. Before I dive into that, I did want to give a quick plug. Trevor and I have oftentimes talked about the impact or the significance of for a third party publisher of being present at conventions, especially if what you're writing is adventures or campaign setting or or a rule set or something like this. Basically, material that that can lend itself to an event that you run. We had CincyCon here a week ago, and so I did 3 events last weekend for that. And so I just wanted to pose another reminder. If you're looking for, hey, how can I get the visibility of my material raised a little bit, running at conventions is a great way to do that, especially, of course, the big ones, Gen Con, Origins, Gary Con, some of these that are high profile ones that have a significant number of people. And so keep that in mind as something that's a great tool for one thing, engaging people with your product, but also giving you a chance as you run these things. It's not just a matter of playtest, but also as you use your materials with a broader swath of people, it gives you ideas of, oh, I should tweak this, I should adjust that, and how to make your products better. That being said, let's dive into the notion of creative block. And so one thing that I think, there's nothing like a con to kick that writer's block. There you go. It can give you some great ideas, absolutely, especially because one of the great things about to me about running games is seeing the interesting creative solutions that one group of players versus another will come up with. And so that helps really flow the creative juices, I think. So what presents a block varies a great deal from person to person, and what makes what is the hardest part about a creative endeavor, again, varies greatly from person to person. I personally, well, there's some things that I'm not even going to try myself. Illustrations, forget it. I haven't an artistic bone in my body. I contract out for that, or I do a couple computer generated things. But there are certain parts of the writing process that sometimes I'll um, run into a stalling point. So, Michael, what do you feel like for you is the thing that might be most prone to give you some delay?
Well, the main issue that I think I know personally I run into, and I think anybody who does any sort of creative endeavor runs, encounters it some way or the other. And I kind of equate it to climbing like a rock wall. and that is that you have to. It's finding that first grip, that first purchase point. Like you can kind of fondle, if you and fumble around with an idea for a while, and just you kind of know what you want to do, and you have this, you have an idea of like where you want to go with it, but you getting that first solid purchase on it, like you're reaching up and grabbing that wall and being able to lift yourself off the ground. I think that's the place where it's easy. I think it's most easy to stall. For me personally, once I start climbing, I don't stop. I might slip back a little bit, but it's that first kind of initial. I have an idea with where I'm going with this,
Hmm.
and that's where I run into the most problems. It's like I'll fumble around with an idea for a while, if everything's going wrong. But once I kind of like creatively feel myself, have a solid grip on that wall, I know that that problem is now over. So that's basically that's the first step is the hardest one. So at least for me and my process.
Yeah, I totally agree. I'm very much the same. For example, on the other hand, in my wife's case, the first book that I put out, we worked on together, and she would kind of go in fits and starts, and she would have some things that she'd concentrate on, and then just kind of hit this pause. Whereas for me, I'm similar, that when once I feel like I've got some traction, then I get a pretty good head of steam going. So you've got a question or a comment. I think having that is great. Just get the ladder and start climbing. Yes, indeed. Um, so let me just give an example from my experience. Uh, so my last book, I got started on Tribes of the North. I got started on. I felt like this was something that a direction I wanted to go to. Just I find the Germanic setting interesting and fascinating. But once I began the project, I just felt like I'm just not feeling it. I'm just not, something about it. It just isn't calling to me yet. And so in my case, I dug out a bunch of podcasts of Viking history and archaeology and legends and so forth, that kind of help get me into the mood of being immersed in. Yeah, I feel like I'm getting the call of this. So have you ever had a case where you needed to try to um take some kind of an angle to help you get that first grab, that first step?
That's all kind of. I do most of that preliminary before I get to the point where I'm actually kind of putting words down. If it's something that involves any sort of, where you're talking about something where you're adapting kind of real world, concepts and stuff. But you can do that also with, either with something that's just completely, made out of whole cloth, out of your
Hmm.
mind. So I think sometimes it's just a matter of me remembering, like where like trying to draw inspiration on something of a similar vein before I begin. Like if I was going to, like, one of the cases, like when I was doing when I was writing Intrigue at the Court of Chaos, I knew that we were going to do something which, like, we had the title before we had basically the adventure was going on. So I knew that we were going to do something with, kind of the cosmic balance and stuff. So I delved into a lot of like Michael Moorcock, like a lot of the the Elric short stories and everything, that because just trying
Hmm.
to get that idea about chaos and how to present that. And that was before I even had put down the first piece of writing down. So that I very rarely do that during the process. All of that is a kind of that's like that's kind of like strapping on your running shoes and and getting ready to hit the track. Like you have to get that ready. And just for me, that cuts down on any sort of false start, and it makes finding that first purchase point all the much easier. because
Hmm.
I can put myself in that mind frame. Like I say, when I did DCC Lankbar, I mean, I read the entire library, the Fafhrd and the Great Mouser stories, front to back and then back to front again. And while I did that, I collected two notebooks of I just writing text and like ideas that library had left down but didn't proceed with or anything, and filled up like a notebook and a half with that. And then after I had done that, that's when I actually started writing DCC Lankbar, because I already
Hmm.
had done all that prep work. So.
Yeah, I think yeah, absolutely. I think that's certainly the ideal is um, the preparation beforehand. Whether it's if it's suppose it's in something that has an appendix N um, connection of some kind. One assumes that if I'm right, say I'm writing an adventure that's an appendix N inspired.
Mhm.
Well, one assumes that I'm doing so because there was something about that particular book that I've always been a fan of or that I really liked. Um, and maybe immersing yourself in that anew. Maybe it's been a few years since you've read it. Get dive back into that. Um, Look at other material by the same author, for example. If on the other hand, if there's something, one of the things that I think is great fodder uh, for adventure ideas is history of the weird. I mean, real world history of bizarre stuff. Because you can get some, they say truth is stranger than fiction. You can get some pretty weird stuff out of just actual stories of weird things that have happened in from historical figures. And so if you're getting started into something based on one of those stories, then just doing some research on well, what other things might there have been that have been similar, for example. And I think those kind of things can also help to provide some spawn of ideas for you.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I'm either gifted or blessed with the idea is that the how do I make this gameable machine never turns off in my head,
Hmm.
which is something that I really wish I could do from time to time. So it's very rarely that I'm like actively seeking out like the inspiration for something. It's more that something has already percolated in my brain and is either written down on a piece of paper somewhere, or or in
Hmm.
a commonplace book, or just something that I just keep turning over in my head. And it's usually something like, it's very rarely that I will take something directly from from a source, unless like with Lankbar, obviously I was working with someone directly, or the Chain Coffin, which was very much inspired by like Manly Way Wellman. More an idea, the idea comes from some throwaway line in something that I was listening, or something that's not even directly related to what I was watching or observing or looking at, but something that was kind of tangentially related. So yeah, so it's one, and then it's like, then once I have that, like once I decide I'm going to pursue that kernel, that's when then I start looking for the ancillary stuff to kind of get me more in that mindset before I actually do the run
Hmm.
at that point. So.
Yeah, and sometimes I feel like that. You said so there are times you wish you could turn that off. I think if anything, I've got a list. If anything, I've got too many ideas waiting on the back burner of,
Hmm.
oh, I could take this and run with it. I could take that and run with it. There's only just so much time to make new publications, and I'm never going to get around to all those ideas. So yeah, I think that I can definitely relate in that sense of especially again, I'm really big into history, and so I listen to a lot of history podcasts. Now, here's something about this. There was this medieval leader who did such and such. I'm like, that is whacked, man. That would make a great adventure.
Hmm.
So
Yeah,
let's see.
I mean, I'm totally in agreement. There is, there's so much of that that you can mine from real world, and I like, for when I did the Adventurer's Almanac, like a lot of that was based on, I basically come up with a bunch of fantastical, holidays and festivals and stuff, and I had gotten a big book on like world festivals. It was this big, thick hardback book, and I just
Hmm.
went on before I even started that. I said, okay, let me just start going through that. and then because they would give like the summation of basically what what the festival celebrates, what they do to to celebrate it and stuff. And there was just so many odd things that were just like like something like we elect a pig as king for the day. It's like well, there's something there. It doesn't have to be a pig. What happens if they elect a local kobold as the king, or
Right, right.
so I mean, yeah,
Oh,
it's
I'm gonna
really
write that one down.
yeah. I mean, I'm a big fan of Ken Height's work, and Ken Height always says it's like like the best game in the world is Earth. It's just he's like you get like don't create something whole cloth when when you have something, you can find something perfectly well on Earth that's already well documented, and then it's just a matter of you doing the research in order to make it come alive at the table. So
Hmm.
and I mean I'm in agreement to that at some point, but I too have a share of fascination for history and the odd bits and corners of it and such. And but again, you can't turn off the idea machine. So,
Right, yeah. Yeah, in fact, we had mentioned our last episode was about map making, and one of the things that Trevor and I both mentioned as a tool for that was um, real world geography. You take some island in the Pacific and zoom in on that, and you can make that your own continent, and then you're going to have a coastline that looks realistic, and it's so likewise. Um, Again, uh, real world history. One of the things that I think is really um, uh, promising too is cryptids. Stories about every society seems like has stories about some kind of fantastical monster, and I think those things provide a great starting point for new creatures and so forth.
hmm. Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's true. But I mean, there's you can find online basically a big like the big giant book of world monsters and mythology and stuff like that. And there's
Hmm.
just so much stuff that you can pull from there, which can sound completely, like you're gonna sound like a genius, but basically where you're just ripping on some idea that is from, like it's a Filipino myth, and outside of anybody who doesn't have anything familiar with Filipino mythology, this is going to be sound like some crazy idea that you or G just come up with, and that's fine, until until you get outed. There's
Oh,
no
right, right, right,
person
right,
like,
right,
I'm Filipino. I know that my grandma used to told me about these things.
right, right.
But for that very brief moment, you can enjoy being a genius.
That's right.
So, yeah.
That's brilliant. Well, although really, let's be quite honest. If you think back to uh first edition or basic D&D, how many of the creatures, if you think of the monster manual, or even back to the basic rules of the creatures that were in there, how many of those were actually created out of whole cloth in Gygax's mind? I I I can't think of anything offhand that stands out as being that probably didn't have some kind of genesis in a legend or folklore in either in Earth or in Tolkien, or okay, you changed the name of Ent to Trient.
And that was more a legal decision. That's so.
Right, right, exactly.
Yeah. But you could, I mean, but even if you do that, you can do the thing which Gary did, either inadvertently or intentionally. You can just get the monster completely wrong. I mean, like because you're working with shoddy research material, like the Gorgon. If we're looking at Greek mythology,
Right, right,
it's not a a gas breathing giant bull. I mean,
right, right,
and a Medusa is singular. I mean, so it's you
right,
can, you can take an idea and then just like change it completely. So especially if the name sounds cool. That's
right, right,
the rule of cool is if the name sounds cool, then you can just always tweak the idea a little bit. I mean.
right,
Nobody says that sheep squatch can't fly or breathe fire, but
right,
if it works in
exactly.
your campaign, sure, why not? So,
Well, and bottom line, that I think is important for people to remember is, in the end, eh, as long as people have fun with the product, that's what you really care about.
mhm.
Um, there's uh I think that most people would recognize that there are very few truly absolutely original ideas. And that's fine. That's okay. You can still be you can still be, if you want, if it's important to you that you be seen as having created a high quality creative work, that you can have a an adventure of hunting down some orcs and still have it be an interesting and creative adventure.
I think I've always been fond of Will Wheaton had a great saying, and that was that there are only 6 original ideas in the world, and Alan Moore has already adapted them better than you ever will. So just don't worry about it. Just do whatever you want to do with it. So
Exactly. Right. Yeah. And so one of the things that brings up that reminds me of, we had a guest some while back, and we were talking about brainstorming with other people about whatever idea, whatever project you're working on. And he said something to the effect of, and I know people are worried that, oh, if I discuss this idea of an unfinished project with someone else, then I'm taking a risk because I'm putting my idea out there. Maybe someone will steal my idea. And I know it's not necessarily rational and all, but I was comforted to hear that I'm not the only person who has that neurosis. But he made the really good point that he said, ideas are easy, execution is hard. Just because someone else hears your idea doesn't mean that they're certainly not going to beat you to the punch on putting out something. So brainstorming, discussing with other folks, hey, I've got this thing, and just kind of talking about possibilities. Allow yourself to let go of, unless there's no one else who has this neurosis besides me. But allow yourself to let go of the concern of, oh, I can't put my unfinished thing out there, or maybe just I can't put it out there yet because it's half baked and people aren't going to think highly of it yet. People recognize what's in process.
Well, it's some no, I don't know if this is 100% true, but I wouldn't put it down. But somebody once relayed to me the historical anecdote that when Fulton patented the steam engine, there were 6 other people independently working on a steam engine without knowledge that everybody else was doing that. So sometimes it's just a matter of being the first one to get it out there. And if you're worried about that like if you have an idea and you're just sitting it and keeping it to yourself and doing nothing with it, I guarantee somebody is eventually going to get it out there before you do. So if brainstorming it and discussing it with other people is going to accelerate the process of actually producing it, then by all means do so, because I guarantee somebody else is already working on that idea or something very similar to that idea, and they may not be talking to anybody, or they may be talking to with a select group, and they're actually making more progress than you are sitting at home just worrying about like how to do this perfectly. So
Right.
sometimes a fast wrong response is better than a slow well reasoned one. Is basically the way to do things in life. I figured out, especially as you said so far. We have far more ideas than we're ever going to get a chance to put out. So we should be producing them rather than we're worried about getting it right necessarily the first time. So,
Right.
yeah.
Well, and to be quite honest too, especially for those of us who are kind of hard on our own ideas, it's probably not as wrong as you think it is. It's um I've seen some truly bad uh products put out directly by mainstream game companies. And so sometimes I could just perhaps comfort myself with, look, all I need to do is be better than that. And I'm not going to name any because I don't, maybe someone else thinks it was a really good adventure or whatever.
Right. It's about setting that benchmark. As long as it's better than the Forest Oracle, you're already ahead of the game pretty much. It's just,
Exactly. All right. So, I think in terms of getting traction, of course, everyone's familiar with the Appendix N type stuff. A lot of times we get spawned an idea from a movie. I recently got this book called Mysterious America. I'm really looking forward to digging into that for some ideas of weird stuff. Like I said, cryptids I thought was a cool concept for providing some fodder. Research for me again, digging into stuff that's happened. Um, you know, I heard one time that gosh, what the heck? I'm having a mental block on his name. Was it George Martin? Game of Thrones. That he drew heavily his inspiration from the Wars of the Roses. And as you hear about some of the whacked things that people did in those wars, yeah, all you got to do is familiarize yourself with some of the things that have actually happened, and that can be great fodder. One of the other things that I find extraordinarily helpful in terms of getting going, or at least it feels like it to me, maybe it's because I'm an organizational freak. I have to organize everything. And so one of the things that I do with any writing project is I make an outline. I feel like it's a lot more daunting to think in terms of producing a book as opposed to producing a paragraph. If I can break down the project into smaller and smaller granular sections, not only does that process of breaking it down help spawn ideas in and of itself, but then as I get it broken down into this subsection 4, subsection A, then I can write on that a lot, and it's a lot less intimidating than the prospect of plunging into the project writ large. Do you have any kind of do you use anything in terms of organizing when you get going into a project?
Almost never. I do not bother outline. I dive in there, and it's like writing is a bar brawl to me. I just grab a table and start hitting somebody. I seriously, I know that outlining is, you save so much trouble, going back. And to me, a project is just going to, if it's any good, it's going to change anyway. I mean, I think my personal record is I've done 7 drafts on one thing before it actually kind of came out and finally worked the way that I wanted to. But usually it's far less than that. Usually I like I say, because by the time I just dive in there, I've already done all that intellectual prep, and I have like an idea of kind of like
Mhm.
where that purchase point is going to be. So once I get in there, I start climbing. I will go back and revise stuff, but I generally am, I guess it's strange because my background is I have a master's degree in library and information science. So technically I should be well versed in organizing information. And I do that as a job, but in my personal life, maybe because I've had to do it so much professionally, that in my personal life I'm just like, woo, let's go see what we're gonna do here. Maybe embrace the chaos, baby. Yeah. It's there have been a couple of times when I've had to do a layout, but they've not been like in depth with some paragraph, and like not more than like 2 bullet points, like indented once or two deep. That's usually that's usually the limit of my stuff, and it's just very big, like spells. Like 20 wizard spells, 20 clerical spells, and we'll figure out when we get there. That's my outlining.
Oh my gosh, I'm itching just at the thought. All right, well then let
I
me
know it
put
doesn't work for everybody, and I'm not recommending it, but part of the whole creative process of figuring out what works for you. Uh,
absolutely.
so
All right, so let me pose you a question then. So you've talked um about having this mental formulation before you get started on the project, where it sounds like you basically have the concepts fairly fleshed out before you start the writing. So then let's suppose we're talking about an adventure module.
okay.
Have you then gotten, I'm assuming by what you described, that you have basically figured out the quote unquote plot or likely routes or see or whether it's events or areas or whatever that compose the adventure. You've got that the composite parts all figured out before you get going.
No, not at all.
Oh, okay. I guess.
I half the times I don't even have a map. Like I come up with, like, I'm working on the adventure that I'm going to run at GaryCon, and like I haven't gotten around to writing it yet because I just haven't time. I said it's 2 weeks out, and I've got to write 2 adventures in 2 weeks. I should really do something about this. So I sat down last night, and I had a title, and I had the inspiration of what I was going to draw upon, and I kind of knew like the overall goal of the adventure in a very loose point.
Mm-hmm.
And then I just sat down last night and just started banging it out. I said, okay, all right, this is where we set up. This is where we're going in there. I think I have an idea of like how it might end or what like the big goal would be. And then I just started writing from literally from room one, like actually from outside. I described like where, cause, because you only have 4 hours in a convention. So I know that we have room of about five encounters tops. So, so I just knew we had a contained area. And then I just started going and I did 2,000 words of it last night. And, I got maybe 2,000 words left to go and, and then create some pre-gen. So over the weekend, that first adventure should be done and ready to be play tested carry con. So I haven't drawn a map yet or anything, but I know what's kind of in the center of it, and I just don't know what we're going to run in between the front door and by the time we get there. But I'll find out tomorrow. I'll sit down and a really good writing day for me is when I am done. I look back at something and I literally have no idea where that came from. And
Mm-hmm.
I do not know. It's the closest thing I've ever experienced to the idea of a Jungian, collective unconscious that I've tapped into something that, that's the closest I am to any sort of religion or spirituality is that, there's every now and then something feels like it came from utterly outside of me.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember doing, I remember when I did so the Sea Queen Escapes. There was one, and I was done at the end of the day, and I had a jellyfish treasure chest, and I was just like, I don't know where that came from. It's like I literally have no idea where I came that idea came from. It's not like I said down. Oh yeah, the treasure will be inside a jellyfish. That'll be perfect. It's a living, and so that's why I do what I do. And if I didn't have that moment as a writer, I would be back in doing, I'd be back doing library science or as I was telling somebody else today, I could have had a nice career as a geologist. So yeah, that's and I'm sure it makes a lot of people really unnervous diving into like an idea like that. But that's just how it works for me. I love the freedom of that, and it does require sometimes you have to go back and you have to throw an idea out completely.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, if you don't throw it out completely, you just put it in the drawer. Then eventually you'll come back to it and use it for something else. So
Right.
there's no wasted writing time as far as I'm concerned. There's times when you write stuff which is not so good and maybe needs another polish or something, or just you go back into the back burner of your brain for another year or something before it's completely ready. But I would rather be in there producing word count that than I would just like kind of muddling over it and try to figure out okay like
Mm-hmm.
I have to figure out like how many squares is this room going to be? Because like once I start describing the counter, I might need a bigger room, I might need a smaller room, I might add like a balcony to put archers on or something. So
Mm-hmm.
it's just, the whole thing is very creative and fluid for me.
Okay, so I guess let me pose you a question then, because when you talked um about your preparation phase and feeling all set before you get started, I had a totally different picture of what that meant because I put that in my own context of how I go through that preparation process. So then if so much of your writing sounds like it's evolutionary and is coming uh and is developing itself perhaps as you're writing,
Mhm.
then what does your preparation consist of that gets you set to where you're ready to go?
It's like marinating meat is basically what it is. It's like if I immerse myself in all sorts of this stimuli, then it's when I'm actually in the midst of stuff, I will be able to draw upon that memory of this song or this thing that I read or the way that like Fritz Leiber would construct dialogue or that all becomes kind of baked in at that point. So so I don't when I'm actually writing, I don't do a lot of I don't have to pull out a lot of reference work, like I
Mm-hmm.
don't have to pull out notes and look at that or anything like that. The most part is any reference is more game mechanics, like how many like what's the armor class of an ogre, and that's all my question. If I come up with a new monster, is it tougher than an ogre? Is it equal to an ogre? Is it weaker than an ogre?
Mm-hmm.
That's just kind of like, and then that's kind of where I will come up with mechanic wise and stuff. But yeah, it really is if you expose yourself to enough stimulus, it just becomes second nature for whichever project you're working on, and that's just how it works for me.
Hmm.
So,
Okay.
as I say, it's kind of like that way into the eventual role playing thing. It might not work for everybody, but it's
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you got to find what works for you. Absolutely. And we did a whole episode once where we talked about finding your muse, and and what gives each of us that creative inspiration. And certainly that applies to getting started. That also applies to keeping yourself going. So all right, so I kind of get the sense that for very different reasons, perhaps, neither of us have a lot of commonly a common occurrence of hitting a wall and running into roadblocks. But as I was giving some thought to this, like I said, there was one project that I worked on where I felt like I needed to re-inspire myself, and that really helped. But so I was just thinking of, well, what kinds of things do I think might be helpful for people who are who do find themselves in that position? And we talked about group brainstorming. And I've been on the receiving end of that several times, where someone who's been working on a project has come and said, hey, I'm stuck on this. And so we just kind of just has some, I guess, maybe just having whether you use the other person's ideas or not, sometimes they can spawn a notion for you. One thing that it was suggested to me, so I asked some other people who did writing, and one thing that someone suggested was do other writing. If you feel like you're stuck on this, rather than just stepping back and not doing something creative at all. And the example that was given was, all right, if you're writing this creative thing that's an adventure or something like that, it's a game supplement, and you're stuck on something, write a character history, or write something about one of your characters that you're deeply invested in and you've played a lot. That should come naturally to you to write a little thing about something that that's part of their experience. And that this person said that really has been at times or something that has helped them to still be in a creative mode and also be kind of stewing with things that could easily spawn an idea for the project that they're working on. And of course, whatever it was that was the idea that got you going, like I said, in my case, I had to re-immerse myself in the things that inspired me to go down the road to begin with. So again, like if it's appendix N type stuff, go back and if it was related to a book or movie, go back and experience it again, or other things by that same artist, or maybe other things that writer or that maybe other tribute to things that have been done inspired by that author or by that movie. Do you ever run into a sticking point in terms of motivation? And let me give you a context of where I'm going with that. One of my favorite authors of all time was Isaac Asimov. And one of the things that he was known for, not just in terms of the quality of his work, but one of the things that he was known for was being a prolific writer. People would often use that term for him. He had written over 200 publications. And people would periodically ask him for tips on how to be prolific. And for one thing, he would say, look, don't make that your goal. Write quality stuff. And if you end up writing in large quantity, that's fine. And then finally he said, okay, fine. If this is really where you want to go, you got to understand that one of the things that means is when it's a gorgeous day outside and you would love to be doing some kind of leisure activity, you got to close the blinds, shut yourself off from whatever, and just focus, force yourself with great effort to focus on whatever you're working on. Mm-hmm. Do you ever run into situations where you've got a project that's maybe a little bit larger scope and you find it hard to keep yourself engaged or to, from day to day, engage yourself into the project?
Well, as we're discovering here is that I am not a good role model for being a writer. Because I will tell you this is that it took me maybe when I was first getting started, but for many years I've not run into that issue, and that's simply because of I discovered the secret, and Asimov is very, very right, and the idea is that writing, whether it be through creativity or motivation, it's muscle memory. And so basically what that means is that long ago, I figured out, all right, this is what my writing schedule is going to be. The first thing I do during the day after I've, gotten up, had breakfast or whatever, and now awake, I start writing.
Hmm.
And I do that at least 5 days a week, sometimes 7 days a week. And I have convinced my brain that when it's writing time, it's time to do writing. So I get into that mode, and I don't run into problems with motivation. I have not run into straight flat, I cannot create anything today type writer's block. Like I haven't had that existential angst crisis, because I am there and it's writing time. And it used to be writing time lasted from when I sat down on my computer until I hit 2,000 words. That was my word count. Every 2,000 words every day.
Hmm.
And that has now changed to 2,000 words a day, or until I attend my first meeting, because or answer my first email. Because once I do that, then writing time is over, because I've had to disengage my brain and go on to something else.
Hmm.
But when I'm working on that, when I'm in that writing, that writing phase of my day, I just go ahead, and I be the first one to say, not everything I'm producing in that period, not all those 2,000 words are golden, but the way that I work, at least they're down on the page. And
Hmm.
then, and now it's I'm continuing to moving and learning more about the adventure or whatever I'm working on, more about the project. And then when I get to the end of it, you know, based on where we are, then it's time to go back again. And then I've already laid out the groundwork, and then it's just a matter of making that better. And whether that means changing things whole cloth, or or whatever. So that is basically that's the creative process. That's the motivation, just to kind of to keep heading toward the end of it, so I can start over again and go through it. Tolkien very famously, he would start writing and he would get to a certain point and didn't like where the story was going, so he would go back and start from scratch, like literally start the story over again from, there once was a hole. And like he if there's the histories of Middle Earth, there's Return of the Shadow, which just talks about his entire process of writing the Fellowship of the Ring. He got to Rivendell, I think, 4 times, with several different characters, and each time he was like, "No, I don't like the way it's going." So he would literally go back and begin in the Shire again, and so I mean, at one point there was like it used to be Bingo Baggins before it was became Frodo Bag. I mean, like once it was Frodo's son. I mean, once it was Bilbo's son. Once it was like, I mean, it's a fascinating reading. Aragorn was originally a Hobbit. I mean, but it didn't work. So he was originally a Hobbit with wooden feet. He wore wooden shoes because his feet got caught up in Mordor. But that wasn't working for Tolkien, so he went back and started all over again. So I am not at that point, but I will go
Right.
back and like start with word one and say, okay, how can I make this existing stuff better? So
Hmm. Well, and I think that's that's worth making the point of that. Um, while from a standpoint of your finished product, it's more important to turn out a good product as opposed to turn out many products. However, from the standpoint of a revision or a building block, it's better to have something down than nothing.
mhm, yeah.
And yeah, and and like you said, I like the term that you put it that where you made the reference to muscle memory, because I certainly have found that the more I write, the easier writing is, and some of that just becomes that your mind is so used to that process. Absolutely. I want to take a quick diversion into. I had seen someone mention something in the chat earlier that actually I was planning to reference, and that is there are other steps at which you might run into a creative block in the project. Uh, maybe it's the process of doing layout. Maybe it's the process of, for those of us who do their own artwork, which is, like I said, certainly not me. Maybe it's the process of generating that artwork. Maybe it's the process of, there are steps that happen with publishing that in terms of, okay, I've got to get together the cover design. I've got to get these different graphics that I've gotten and arrange them just so, and I've got to do my layout for my pages, and One thing that I would throw out for some of these things, and we've talked about this before, is simply, if you get to a point where you've written what you feel like is a good manuscript, and that layout is just, it's like pulling your own teeth, you know, give some consideration to delegating. Find someone who will do that layout process for you. Um, I know there are people. I know there's ways you can get that done professionally. I haven't the slightest idea how much that costs because I do my own layout. But on the other hand, I don't do any of my own artwork except for the maps that I do in campaign cartographer. And so recognize at some point what is a piece of the process that isn't up your alley, and bring in some help. Is there anything that you run into where, no, I know I'm sure there are certain things that make it different because being part of Goodman, there are probably people who deal with specific facets that you hand off to.
Yeah, that's very much the case. I have only self-published two things, and well, three things technically, but I mean, I did my two Stonehell books, but they were the first books that I had ever kind of written, and I had to do everything myself. So it wasn't, it was a problem to be overcome. So I didn't, and I already had the manuscript. It was just more actually, I think I was kind of writing, because I laid everything out in Microsoft Word, like, so because I had no idea what I was doing. So
Mm-hmm.
I had pretty much laying out the book as it went. There was just a lot of tweaking, because it was all a new process to me. I didn't run into that situation like I felt like I was getting, I wasn't, yeah, and like it was a challenge to me.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I thrived on that rather than got really, really stymied by it or anything. But I'm sure if I had done more than two books, I mean, there's also a reason that I put out Stonehell and it took me like 6 years to put out the sequel to it. Mostly because I was a victim of my own success. And it's really easy to put off your own projects when when somebody else is paying you to do stuff. So by the time I got around to doing the second book, I had forgotten everything, so it was kind of like a new process all over again. So yes, I'm not the best one to like, I'm not that familiar with that aspect of like the third party publishing thing. I've done it
Mm-hmm.
three times, and two of them were on a big scale, and one was like just like a zine. So and I really had simplified the zine thing because nobody has big expectations for that. And yeah, and all my art was like what was bought. The only thing I did were my own maps, and that was just basically creating them in Photoshop. So again, like because I didn't know what I was doing, so I did it the hard way. That's the down part of sometimes just diving in. There's an easy way to find out, and if you do it by just diving in, you figure it out in the process. So when you do it again, you're smarter, but it's not that easy the first time around.
Right. Okay, so a couple quick points of summary. There's whatever kind of inspiration it was that got you going. Revisit that. If you need to bring in other people, whether it's part of brainstorming or uh, helping with some of the building blocks, don't be afraid to do those things. And bottom line, the part of the goal of this series has always been to encourage people that, hey, look, you too can do this. You too can do third party publications. You just have some confidence and go into it. Likewise, give yourself enough, give yourself some forgiveness in the writing as well. That if I do a bit of writing and it's not the first draft isn't that perfect gem, that's okay. And don't let that hold you back, because I feel like sometimes that's one of the things that creates an artificial slump. Well, we have run up to our time limit. We got to make way for the next program. So 2 weeks from now, we are not airing because of Gary Con, and so then after that, we'll get some information out regarding what our next follow up then episode will be 4 weeks from now. I want to thank again Michael Curtis for joining us for this conversation.
Thank you for having me.
And good night, Go to Games fans. We'll catch you later.